After the success that Scooby-Doo Where Are You received, William Hanna and Joseph Barbera were driven to have a whole bunch of reboots and spin-offs made for the show, which took up a hefty portion of their legacy, practically spanning the rest of their lives. The franchise ended up becoming such a huge success that Cartoon Network and Warner Brothers were motivated to keep making spin-offs and reboots even after the creators' passings. The later shows started seeping into Cartoon Network over the next couple years, with one of those reboots being Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated, airing from 2010 to 2013. And this show gave us a lot more to offer than your average Scooby-Doo show. It had quite a handful of details that really made it stand out, from the unique animation to the story arcs, which I'll go more into throughout the ranking, and let's not forget the cast. As you'd expect, Frank Welker came back to play Fred. As for the other characters, while they weren't played by their actors from the original show, the chosen cast members still had plenty of experience with the characters, like Grey DeLisle as Daphne, Mindy Cohn as Velma, and Welker filling in as Scoob. As for Shaggy, while they managed to get Casey Kasem in this show, he actually played Colton, Shaggy's dad. This also happened to be Kasem's final performance, as he unfortunately passed away a year later. As for Shaggy himself, his role was filled by Matthew Lillard. You might remember him. He first played Shaggy in the live-action movies back in the early 2000s, and he seems to be standing strong with that character nowadays, which is kinda saying something, especially when you consider that Lillard's legacy in this franchise, as great and stable as it is today, was built up from...
You're in trouble. Oh boy!
Right.
Besides them, there were a ton of recurring side characters that appear throughout, one of my favorites being Sheriff Bronson Stone, voiced by Patrick Warburton, for reasons I'll get to later. And they even brought back an older, more obscure character, Vincent Van Ghoul, who originated from the 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo back in 1985. Back then, he was voiced by the legendary Vincent Price. But Vincent unfortunately passed away long ago, so they had to find someone else to fill his role. And his replacement ended up being Maurice LaMarche, who I'm sure you'll recognize from at least one cartoon. I mean, heck, this guy's been all over the place in the last couple years. And sure, his Van Gogh impression isn't bad or anything. I mean, yeah, he still kinda sounds like he does with most of his other characters that he's played in other shows, but his Van Gogh impression is still pretty decent. Anyway, on to the main topic, the villains themselves. Just like your average Scooby-Doo show, we're looking at culprits in costume. For the most part, at least. So that's why we're here. I'm gonna go through them all one at a time from my least favorite all the way up to my top favorite. As I was putting this list together, I found this to be a much bigger challenge in comparison to the Where Are You ranking, as the show has quite a rise in villain quantity. While Where Are You was only 25 episodes long, this show ran for 52 episodes, more than double what the first show had. But thankfully there's a bit of a crunch, as some villains were given more than one episode, and as a result, the villain count's been narrowed down, specifically to 49. So yeah, it's still gonna be quite the marathon, and still means I had to put more thought into the list arrangement, but this crunch helped save a bit of production time. So just like before, I'm mostly gonna share my thoughts on each villain, try to explain my reasons for their position on the list, shove some villains in the same ranking slot if they share the same episode, and bring up some episode details that stood out to help me break some ties. Alright, now it's time to go. Starting at number 49. The Alien Trio, Grey, Reptoid, and Nordic. So we may have seen some interesting aliens from this franchise in the past, whether it's the alien invaders or even the space kook. Those guys left a great impression, but these guys... the only thing great about them is that they were just a great step down. Like, they were absolutely disappointing in more ways than I thought at first. It's bad enough that their designs don't really stand out. Like the Grey, who was completely bland and forgettable. The Reptoid was a little better, but still didn't really give us much. And the Nordic was probably the best looking of the bunch, but that's not saying much given who she's working with. Besides that, these guys barely do anything in their mystery at all. The most action we got was from Nordic, and the biggest thing we see her do is steal Space Kook's suit. But why though? What did that have to do with their plan? Speaking of, their plan was a letdown too. You might think that because we have 3 culprits working together, they must have something special in store. But no, there was no goal to speak of. Instead, their plan consisted of nothing more than an extremely vague theft spree. And even when it looked like they would have some interesting tricks up their sleeves, all those extra details turned out to be wild coincidences that had nothing to do with them. So had these guys decided to strike in another time or place, they wouldn't have seemed like such a big deal. In fact, the only reason they seemed like a big deal in the first place was because Sheriff Stone kept losing his mind over them. Or that is to say, he was afraid of losing his mind to them. So yeah, these 3 were quite a letdown. But I should say that even though these three were my least favorite villains in the show, they still weren't god-awful. Heck, I'd say they're more interesting than the Ape Man any day. And even if these guys weren't so great in the end, there were still many better villains that appeared throughout the show.
I got this great body pillow you can borrow.
I don't need some silly body pillow.
The Humongonauts. I've been going back to these guys multiple times for the sake of notes, and I still find these two to be some of the blandest, most forgettable villains in the show. And the things I do remember about them just came off kinda lame. Sure, they're big and fierce, but most of the time that can only get you so far. At first it looked like these guys were gonna give us something memorable by destroying all these different spots in Crystal Cove, but then it ended up leaving no impact, since it was all completely rebuilt anyway. So basically, there was little to no impression that we got from these guys. For a brief moment, Mr. Nails, the construction worker, did seem like he was going to be involved, which could have probably led to something, but then the whole thing was kind of revealed with the Manor twins. It's bad enough their suspicion came from the fact that we never saw them the whole time this was going on, but they even made the monsters the same color as their advertisements. For real, what was their thought process? But then again, I can't entirely blame these guys alone for how they turned out. There was just too much happening in this episode to give them some better build-up. And even still, I wouldn't say they were completely terrible. Their fight scene, while short and unnecessary to the story, did give a bit more use out of their designs. And I'll admit it was slightly interesting to watch. But besides that, they mostly felt like tossed-to-the-side villains. I can assume these guys might be able to grab the attention of some WWE fans, but as for me, they were just disappointing. But at least we were able to get a similar version of these guys at a later point in the show, and they actually worked out better. The Vampire. Okay, so she looks really cool, and she's crazily active. Her appearance and her attack forms were enough to make her look like a decent threat, that's for sure. But besides that, there are no other interesting qualities she has. Probably the worst thing about her was how her mystery was laid out. It was a complete mess. What do I mean? Well, I'll let this guy sum it up.
I'm sure none of you can guess who's behind the vampire's mask. What's that? You think it's Sheila? Of course not. Don't be silly. This mystery's far more complex than that. For all you know, it could possibly be, Nan Blake. Surely you believe that, right? What? You don't? Well, what if we showed you some random clips of her doing suspicious things? That ought to convince you, right? You still don't believe it. Well, we'll just keep showing more of her suspicious activities until you do believe it. All right, time for the big reveal. Psych! It actually was Sheila the whole time! We totally had you fooled!
And you know, this kind of setup could have worked regardless. But what pushed the vampire and her mystery over the side was the layout of the suspects. To be fair, Sheila wasn't painfully obvious on her own, but pushing Nan into light every time she was on screen ironically had the opposite effect they were trying to go for, making Sheila one of the most obviously suspicious culprits we ever got in the show. Her motive wasn't even that interesting either. She was just on a desperate hunt for a magic makeover. I'm not even kidding. That's all she was after. And to top it off, she just believes in it without seeing any actual proof herself? And sure, there have been plenty of culprits in the show who've had pretty nonsensical motives, so that's to be expected, but Sheila's motive was way flatter than a lot of others. While her design and the first impression she gave us was spot on, the rest of what she had to give us was very disappointing. Thankfully, there are still plenty of villains to go through, and they keep getting a little better with each passing step we take. The Creeping Creatures. So we have another trio, and unfortunately, they also ended up with an unexpectedly disappointing outcome. It's bad enough that the first three and only three suspects for the creatures happen to be acting this creepy. And when you see the creatures in their entirety, straight under light, it becomes painfully obvious who they are. Guys? I think you forgot something. Your hair? You're not gonna do anything about that? You don't think this is gonna ruin your disguise? Okay, sure. You'd think they were making them like this for a reason. maybe to throw us off, and maybe under those costumes would be some surprise culprits as a twist. That could have definitely worked. I mean, they couldn't possibly be the only 3 people we've seen in Gatorsburg, right? No, it was them exactly. I guess I shouldn't complain too much. I mean, they were putting a lot of attention on their gator accessories, but apparently too much attention was given that they were practically foaming in everything else. They couldn't even bother to enhance security on their secret? Sure, they chased the gang out, but none of these guys thought they would come back? There are 3 of them, and yet no one thought to keep guard? The only reasons I didn't put them any lower in the ranking was mostly because of their first impressions. They really got me hooked in with their opening attack. The costumes looked pretty neat from a distance, and in the dark, they gave off the threatening appearance they deserved. And I can kinda see where they were going with their motive too, keeping people off certain parts of the land to hide their secrets of the fake accessories just to keep making a profit, but that's pretty much all they had going for them. It's a shame they couldn't be bothered to put more thinking into their bigger details, or for that matter, some of their other details that could have helped them go farther. The Dandy Highwayman. There's an oddly specific, but still kinda interesting story to this guy. From what I can gather, he was created out of inspiration from the Adam and the Ant song Stand and Deliver, which by the way was also a title of the episode he ended up in, which further cements that claim. I guess some folks behind the scenes were big enough fans of the song to have him featured in the show. So yeah, he may have been thought up by some unique sourcing, which by extension made he himself unique in a way. However, that didn't stop his execution from making him one of the weaker villains. Sure, there were still a few pluses to him. He was armed with pistols to make him a bit of a threat at least. His performance and looks admittedly helped give him a slight charm, and he's got a motorcycle to make a quick and somewhat snazzy getaway. So, what was the problem? Well, plain and simple, while it did seem like there was a lot going on with him, the factors I listed about his routine were all given to other villains as well, and I feel they were just handled better by them in the end. So all we really got here is a robber with a pretty boy kind of feel that looks like he's on his way to some fancy dress party. Which in some ways wouldn't be too bad, but for a franchise that focuses so much on villains with supernatural elements, and then suddenly showing a flat human type of villain out of nowhere, I can't help but find him a little jarring as a result. But still, there were a few reasons why I didn't put him lower in the ranking. While a lot of his features may not have been all that original, they weren't played out too badly. His motorcycle skills were honestly kinda neat to watch, and he had that dramatic British tone which I found to be oddly fascinating. Like there was a bit more soul and care in the performance than I was expecting. And some of his monologue I found to be oddly enticing in some parts. And we have James Marster to thank for that. He's best known as Spike from Buffy the Vampire Slayer in capes that helps you fellows recognize him.
And what can I tell you, baby? I've always been bad.
His mystery was also nicely backed up by having Pole Boy as his red herring, given that he both looks and sounds so much like him. And given that you don't really see him do much in the episode, that made it easier to assume he was probably doing something suspicious, like he was probably building up to something. But then you have the actual culprit, the librarian. While he probably had one of the most innocent motives in the show, I can't help but think there was a bit more he was hiding. Looking back on him, it just feels like there were other implications he was giving off. Like where he showed interest in getting some of the people's valuables, aside from their loved ones. He may have had some charm to him presentation-wise, but as a villain at core, I still found him to be one of the most confusing of the bunch. The Graveyard Ghoul. Well, as far as villains go in this series, this was certainly one of the more basic of the bunch. Sure, he might have had a unique design and a pretty fierce growl too.
Be quiet! Shut up!
But what else does he have to offer aside from that? Well, not much, unfortunately. In general, he mostly comes off as one of the weakest villains we've seen so far, as he just barely puts up any sort of fight. And from a distance, it may not help that this guy's structure was kinda similar to that of the vampire, with the culprit and red herring both feeling unnecessarily forced. However, I noticed that this time the circumstances helped both of their sides play off in a much more comical way, which kinda did help boost the ghoul's appeal a little bit more, even if it wasn't of his volition. And this also helped emphasize the style of humor this show knew how to capture. But while these details were nice for the ghoul's episode, I still wouldn't say they were a huge help to the ghoul himself. Regardless, Ivalo had a smaller detail that helped him stand out a little bit more as a culprit, even if it was just a slight detail. By making his mask look a lot like his actual face, it would have been enough to make it seem less likely that it would have really been him. And whether or not he was intending that, it was still pretty smart on his end. But it still didn't build up a lot in his overall impression, especially with a lot of other villains we're coming up on soon. He may have stood out a little on his own, but didn't exactly stand tall per se. The Horrible Herd. As you might imagine based on their design, They're a lot faster and stronger than normal cows. And on their own, they're surprisingly smart too. By taking away a lot of Crystal Cove's main exit routes, this leaves a lot of the citizens entirely helpless against their attack. So overall, their presentation and routine alone can come off great at times. But even with all that said, it may look strange that I'd still place them this low in the ranking. And the one thing that brought them down this far was the structure of their mystery. Or lack thereof, I should say. It only took halfway through their episode for the gang to find all the answers to the mystery. Like for real? This has gotta be one of the most rushed mysteries the gang's been through. It certainly didn't help that it happened to be the most obvious culprits who were behind it, being the main villains, Professor Pericles, and the Destroido team. Only for them to do nothing for most of this, expecting everything would turn out fine for them. Cause, you know, that's how it always works.
Not.
Though that's not to say this would have been a terrible reveal from the start. Maybe if there was some kind of twist later where Ricky's scientists had a plan to take control of the herd and have them attack them by his command for his own reasons, and maybe he, or probably Brad and Judy, needed the help's gang to take them down after all, I don't think many would have seen that coming, and that would have probably helped make them a little more interesting. But even with the screen time given to the herd destroying the town, and with some shots admittedly being rather neat to watch, I personally couldn't help but feel their novelty quickly dying down once they wrapped up the who, where, why, and how on this whole thing. Sure, they've shown they could be quite menacing on a pretty big scale, but in the end, what we were mostly left with was an unexpectedly forgettable herd that tried to come off important, but kinda fell flat instead. The Dragon. So I ended up putting this thing right next to the horrible herd, mostly because they both share a very similar problem. There was a rush on their mystery's reveal, which again takes away a good portion of the satisfaction from that mystery. Although I decided to put the dragon a little higher than the mystery herd because the reveal wasn't actually that bad this time. Sure, you could say Zin, the mastermind behind this, may have been a little too generic in some ways, given what they were trying to go for, but at least there were a few smaller details through him and his dragon that helped stand out a little. Like the unique fight scene and the fact the gang got some help through the Blue Falcon and Dynamut. Now that'll make a nice wink to the longtime Hanna-Barbera fans. And yeah, even if they gave away most of the important details right then and there too, there were still a decent sample of features to the dragon itself that still made it kinda interesting throughout. Like how they gave it a robotic aesthetic which helped give it more advantages as opposed to what a normal dragon probably would have had in this scenario. And on top of that, there was also Zen's motive behind all this, as he just wanted to keep his daughter from getting killed by this thing. Sure, the setup may not have been that smart, but it was touching to see he'd go this far just to save her. While some of the dragon's screen time and details may have been mostly forgettable from a distance, there were still some surprisingly nice factors that come out of it too, and I'm sure Zen and his daughter will remember all this, wherever they may be now. Night Fright. I'll admit, while there are some details that I feel gave him a bit more of an appeal, he unfortunately was not as well fleshed out as he could have been, for reasons I'll get to in a bit. So his very first impression actually gave off a pretty nice effect. By having him blend in with the costume monsters Van Gool did have planned out, that alone gave him a surprisingly smart and rather unique entrance. His design was also a nice bonus. It helped show a more creative side to the culprit behind his mask, which is pretty ironic, and you'll see why shortly. Yeah, he's got a nice look, he's planned a lot of his routine in a rather smart way, he's shown to be pretty strong and agile, he's got everything to make him a decent villain. So, why the lower place? Well, it's simply because of one detail that should be easier to overlook, but in this case, it surprisingly wasn't. For whatever reason, this guy decided to give himself some heavily limited dialogue. Literally 3 lines worth.
I am Night Fright. Scream! Scream! Time for you to die!
So you could imagine his whole appeal can get old pretty quickly. And to think that Argus, the culprit behind all this, actually considers himself a professional horror writer? He dressed up as a character he himself made and used it as a threat just for the sake of a promotional stunt? And he didn't think this could have gotten him in trouble and had his cover blown, especially without any possible red herrings? Man, and here I was giving him credit for playing smart, but it's really hard to ignore the cracks he left. Needless to say, it gets a little exhausting hearing him use the exact same lines over
I am Night Fright.
and over
I am Night Fright.
again.
I am Night Fright.
And I know it's the joke that he's a sucky writer, but that doesn't change the point that this guy can get disappointingly bland and fast. Personally, I feel this guy could have had a better played out routine just by spouting cheesy one-liners. Yeah, that would have also gotten old after a while, but at least it could have given him a bigger variety in dialogue. And on top of that, this could have probably shown that he'd have a bit more potential in his writing too. This could have probably helped artists go farther outside of that movie that we'll probably never get to see.
Bye, everyone. See you on the big screen in 10 to 20 years.
So Night Fright may have had some things weighing him down, but I still found some things about him kinda interesting in the end. And if nothing else, he helped give us a decent first impression of this new version of Van Ghoul.
Did someone say dessert?
Hebediah Grimm. Now this is something new. We've never really seen this kind of villain portrayed this way at this scale before. His design was original, creative, and rather threatening too. The writers knew there are very few things in this world that are scarier than a modern-day Puritan. So anyway, this was one of those examples where even if he was simplistic, he still had some stuff going for him. With his unique design, his abnormal height, and his ginormous hammer. And his voice was spot on.
For your painted faces, and clothes that rise above the ankle and fall below the neck, you three women folk shall be judged!
Some of you may not have known this, but his voice was done by the one and only Clancy Brown, who a lot of us will most likely recognize as the voice of Mr. Krabs.
Panty raid? You're talking about girls, right? And you're talking about raiding their dressers for their underpants, right?
But even with all this going for him, why was this guy placed so low on the list? Well, despite his unique appearance, the likely red herring Dougal, and smart planning that Gary and Ethan put into him in some details, there were other details that were not so smart, and they heavily show. It was painfully obvious that Gary was going to be involved, as he'd show up on the scene more than he should, but his fake video chat was what really did him in.
If you're not Hebediah Grimm, then why are you always there when he attacks?
I'm happy to answer all your questions, guys, but first look out!
Come on, dude, there's no way you could have seen him from that angle. For that matter, Ethan's more so to blame in that regard for almost blowing their cover. He was in on this too, so he should have done a better job on the positioning. Not to mention how one of these guys ruined the only potential red herring they had. At some points, it felt like they wanted to be found out, which is definitely not a good sign. Sure, these guys gave surprisingly great performances for the most part, especially for soccer pros, but it's details like these that made their mystery come off a little sloppy. From a distance, I like the plan these two had going. To have both of them be Grimm so one of them would look like a hero in some issues and vice versa, but they could have left a greater impression if not for these kinds of details that could have been easily cleaned up and not left out in the open. Fake Fred and Daphne. These two may have been a little more on the unique side in some ways, but they still happen to share a similar problem I had with Zentuo from the original show. While they did have an impressive atmosphere to interact with, the villains themselves just couldn't really hold up as strongly as their setting did. Though I will admit, they did have a bit more going for them, for reasons I'll get to later. So there are two sides to this routine. There was Fake Fred's side, which despite the impressive illusion of looking like Fred's reflection was dragging him in, there was not much else to him, and he started getting bland after a while. And it's either because you could tell who this really was, or because Zen was just a lot flatter than Fake Daphne's. Though to be fair, Fake Daphne did have a lot to offer. As she and Fred are in this alternate Crystal Cove where it's implied everyone died, even the gang. And now they're running for their lives trying to save themselves from the remaining skeletons, and man, all this sounds awesome! Plus she knew how to cleverly tie in their motive with all this going on too. I think it's fair to say Fake Daphne, or Judy, definitely had the better share here. Although even with all that, there are still a few details it couldn't exactly hide that well. Like, yeah, this alternate Crystal Cove looks nice and all, but what happens when they reach the end? She's going by Fred's word, but there had to be a chance where he was probably getting too close to the edge. What would have happened then? And even still, for the most part, both Fake Fred and Daphne were giving off a performance that was kinda obvious who was gonna be based solely on their voices. Then again, Judy as Daphne may have had a bit more of a surprise to her, as it would have been harder to focus on that factor given the heft of shock value we're given through hers and Fred's story. Though on the other side, where things are a lot more toned down, it was a lot easier to expect it was gonna be Brad behind this. Or maybe it could have been someone who happened to sound a lot like him. What was not expected, however, was finding out they went the extra mile resorting to plastic surgery to take on these new looks. Yeah, for once they didn't go for the standard masks. They legit and willingly put themselves through the trouble to make their actual faces look like this. Now that's a great form of dedication to detail. But again, I feel Brad should have gone further with his cover. Like if he had a voice disguiser sound a bit more like Fred, that would have made his side a little more interesting. But I suppose the big fight between these two helped boost fake Fred's side a little in the end. Though even with all the unique elements these two fakes had, they were still surprisingly another of the not-so-memorable villains from this era. K. Horrifico. This villain happened to have the youngest culprit in the show behind him, which was kinda interesting. But overall, this was still a rather hit-or-miss kind of villain. He had a neat entrance. His finish, however, was not so neat. But I'll get into that in a moment. So from a distance, he looks like he may have a lot going for him. He had an interesting presentation with his unique ancient robing and rather creepy mask, and you can see he's very devoted to the act. And he's not alone. He's got all the kids in the neighborhood for his backup. It's surprising how he managed to get all these youngsters to cooperate so well. And boy, do they ever put up a fight. But that's pretty much all the positives I have to give him, because the rest of his atmosphere just goes downhill from here. While there was a lot of thought put into some of his details, as a result there were others that really didn't help. For starters, he could have done a better job disguising his voice. Honestly, I could tell who it was under the mask the very second he first spoke. Or I should say, she first spoke. And yeah, there was Dr. Portillo, who seemed like a possible red herring, but comparing his voice and height with Marianne, I think it's more obvious what the reveal was gonna be. And maybe this is just me, but I still found it kind of frustrating how her plan just abruptly stopped, due to the kids getting distracted. Like, you're telling me this show's really good enough to get them all to stop at once?
This was lame.
You know, for such a well-established genius, I certainly wasn't expecting Marianne to make such big slip-ups. She seemed like the type who could have had everything planned out. Like, you're telling me she had no failsafe or anything? I know she's just a kid herself and not some kind of miracle worker, but she managed to get this far on her own, so what was stopping her from more preparation or backups? So yeah, this mostly ended up as a bit of a shame. But even if her takedown was disappointing, she still managed to make this monster one of the more visually and potentially appealing villains in the show. The Shadowy Orc. So this guy has a very loose connection with this biker gang, the Wild Brood. And I gotta say, despite their unusual design choice, I found these guys to be surprisingly charming. By the way they look, talk, their own voices and strength, right down to some of the things they themselves have to say. It's an odd feeling, but it can come off kind of endearing in some ways. It's not every day I see people who can fight for themselves physically and verbally to this degree. They can come off so smooth and poetic at times. And acknowledging using their masks to hide their true faces? This is the kind of stuff I feel some people can find pretty relatable. And it's weird, because this is the kind of stuff I would have never expected to feel from a group of cosplayers in a Scooby-Doo show of all things. And trust me, had these guys been the villains in this situation, I would have put them a lot higher in the ranking. But they weren't. Instead, we have the not-so-memorable outcast as the big threat here. Though yeah, he does have some things going for him that did make him a little threatening, albeit he just wanted to crash a train that contained the game console he was going after. But as far as his motive goes, that was basically it. His shallow depth when compared to his way more fascinating gang didn't really help him leave that much of an impression. And overall, this guy was mostly just another conflicting choice. Like, as an outcast of the gang, he had a fairly decent routine, but as his own villain, he should have had more to offer to help him stand out. And sure, his similarity to the Wild Brood made it easier for him to pin the blame on them, but aside from that, there wasn't really anything else to make him that much unique. Maybe if the guy had his own bike gang with their own special elements, that might have made him feel more like an equal. And that could have probably made him more interesting in some ways. But in the end, he was mostly just an unfortunately forgettable rebel against a rather fascinating biker gang. Though with said biker gang in mind, as unlikely as it may seem, I do hope we get to see them come back to this franchise someday. The Cicada Creature. This thing was certainly different, and yet surprisingly not quite as memorable as a lot of the other villains here. Though I will say the concept is fairly creative. There may be plenty of people in this world that are creeped out by cicadas on their own, but what about a huge cicada made up from a huge swarm of cicadas? And yeah, seeing them all team up on any given victim anywhere at any time here could easily be enough to make anyone squeamish. The giant cicada though, that's where I'm more mixed on the feelings. Like yeah, it is visually impressive, with its smooth animation and formation in general, but we never really get to see what kind of attacks it can pull off in this form, if anything. And even when it does get a chance to attack its victims, its giant form never really gets the screen time to show off what it's capable of. Cicadas. Cicadas. Which can kinda take away a bit of the impression. Like maybe if we saw more of the impact in this form, like showing it wrecking a car or a building or something, you know, something to make it come off stronger than just the swarm itself. That could have helped boost up the potential threat it had. We got to see it break through a wall, kinda, but seeing more of that could have helped give it a more menacing image. Though aside from that, there are some other positive details this thing had. Like one, that's pretty common among other villains, but still nice in general, is that the Cicada Creature had a decent balance between the culprit and a red herring. With Grandma Moonbeam and her product connected to Destroido, as well as Dr. Yans with his love of cicadas showing up at the same time this is happening, it made them both come off as very likely suspects. And Moonbeam knew how to control all these cicadas in an efficient way that still gave off the scare she was going for, which was fairly clever for what she was trying to accomplish. So yeah, there may have been some details surrounding the Cicada Creature that were pretty nifty, but the creature itself was still not that memorable all things considered. You know, kinda like Fake Fred and Daphne. But unlike those two, the Cicada's details did a better job building up the creature itself and not just the atmosphere around it. And that did help give it a decent impression in some way. Well, maybe not a great staple, but it still made a fairly doable creepy crawler in its own way. The Gluten Demon. Alright, let's get this remark out of the way. Look, it's a cartoony version of Nikocado! Or a more cartoony version anyway. But yeah, this thing's essentially just Nikocado Avocado, long before his reputation even started. Just throwing a ruckus and eating a lot. And that's just about everything we got from it. A unique design for sure, but the things they let it do are surprisingly limited. I mean, it's all centered specifically around food and gluten. But as someone who's allergic to that stuff, I guess it can be a little threatening in some way. I will say though, there are still a few interesting details we got from the demon. The entrance was pretty creative, and the fact that the culprit's motive was both built from a callback to a previous episode, and made a lot of sense. Plus, even with the lack of powers this thing had, it still managed to put up a decent fight. Even if a portion of it felt like it was made up of... Deviant art material? I don't know. There were some details I thought were done nicely, but this thing just felt like a confusing decision overall. The Scare Bear. I'll be honest, at first I thought I was gonna end up downright hating this thing, as it just seemed like a generic evil bear from a distance. Which, yeah, it still kinda is in some ways, and on its own, it might not sound that interesting. Though as some of you can probably guess, I'm not the biggest fan of monsters based solely on just one animal in this franchise anyway. As if my treatment toward the ape man didn't tell you enough. While not a hugely great example, it was still better than I was expecting. Its impression was also partially built up from the Cicada Creature too. While that was mostly just a warning threat that had a connection to Destroido, the Scare Bear more so serves as showing a potential threat to their harmful decisions, both in the form of this mutated presence, and another example I'll bring up in a moment. Admittedly, the bear's details may have been more limited than other villains, but at least it knew how to put them to some rather neat uses. The sharp claws may have been enough of a threat, but it also has some great strength to help with the presentation, also proving that the muscular look is not just for show. And this brings us to my personal favorite detail from the Scare Bear. As strange as it may sound, I feel the best thing we got from it was part of the reveal. The fact that Benson didn't even need a costume, due to the fur being genetically stuck to him, was a pretty big surprise.
And every last inch of me's covered with hair.
But at the same time, it was efficient, smart to his routine, and honestly kinda funny. As someone who tends to be one of those tough crowd guys at times, I'll admit this was unexpected, but still got a fairly good laugh out of me. Though I will say there are a few small downsides the bear had. They may have been justified in one way or another, but they're still worth pointing out. Like how Avocados mostly came off like an unnecessarily forced red herring. Not the worst example we got from the show, but it was obvious to tell it wasn't gonna be him. But don't worry, he'll have more chances to shine later. And there's the Scare Bear's defeat, which came off unfortunately rushed.
I don't think the Scare Bear is gonna disarm this bomb.
Bomb? I didn't set a bomb.
You can talk?
Of course I can talk. Where's this bomb?
It may have been for a good reason to get rid of the bomb, but still it would have been nice to see what other kinds of attacks the bear was capable of. Overall, there are plenty of other villains who managed to top the Scare Bear, but I should say the bear itself still delivered some decently special surprises, and I'm willing to give it a bit more credit for them. The Phantom. Just to get this out of the way, there's one returning factor in this guy's routine that we have to give him some credit for. And I think we all know what it is.
X-Girl!
I'm a hex girl, and I'm gonna put a spell on you.
Hell yeah, they are back! and they are just as rockin' as ever. So as we can see, this guy gives off vibes kinda similar to Phantom of the Opera. Makes some sense as he's called the Phantom, and he's adding supernatural effect to the stage trying to make it seem like the Hex Girl show is haunted. I can definitely feel the similarities between that and the original story, and that on its own is a pretty unique concept we rarely get to see in much of this franchise. And what we got in this instance from said concept was visually memorable in some ways. A techno-looking version of the Phantom of the Opera is a pretty neat idea, and he has just as neat details sometimes. Like his entrance and the powers we see from him, they're a great spectacle, and they can make him look decently menacing too. But as neat as he may come off while on stage, that's also a pretty glaring setback for him as a whole. All his neat details are mainly on stage, meanwhile all his flashy attacks are notably absent when he's somewhere else. And this unfortunately really limits the impression he was giving off. Maybe if he found a way to make his visual effects more portable, and probably make it look like he can be menacing with the same kind of powers elsewhere, there's a chance that could have made him more fascinating. And we could have seen more of a variety of attacks from him aside from burning the bus, which is basically the only real attack we see him do off stage. But the stage effects he does use are honestly very impressive. It's apparent that Daniel, the culprit, knew how to use this place in particular for his own attacking ground, giving him plenty of ideas to help raise up his plans for attacks. And on top of that, Daniel knew some ways around his disguise. By changing up his appearance from the past, it would have seemed more likely that Gus would have been the one behind this, given his outward persona and his stronger looking connection to the Hex Girls. So it would have made sense that Daniel would try to have the blame pinned on him. While the Phantom may not have given off anything too big overall, what he did deliver helped leave more of an impact on the Hex Girl show in some ways. Plus he gave us more of a chance to see the Hex Girls themselves, which is always a win in my book. The Fright Hound. I see what they were trying to go for with this thing, and I like some of what they did with it, but there are still a handful of details that kinda made it fall flat. The execution gives off a pretty unique impression at first glance, a rather vicious, demon-possessed looking version of Scooby. Plus, this thing was created for the means to slander Scoob himself, and that had the potential to really go somewhere. But why was he being targeted? Well, I'll go into that in a bit. Essentially, it was the design this thing had that stood out to me the most. For the first half of its mystery, it gives off the impression of the Ghostbuster demon dogs. The next, they go full-out Terminator.
You're terminated, fucker!
Even with these two extremely different franchises, they knew how to merge it into the same thing and make it work. They managed to make it look threatening enough while still making it look fitting for the show's atmosphere. But what hurt the Hound's atmosphere for me was the reveal. True, Jason did have a lot going for him to be seen as the culprit, but of course it wouldn't have been that easy to jump to conclusion just yet, as is usually customary for these writers to throw in the twist culprit, as well as the motive, even if it's still a little quirky. But this time, it didn't do the Hound any favors. Out of everyone that could have been behind the controls, they had to go for his hover mom. And her plan? She thought this would make the gang break up and leave Velma alone for Jason to swoop in and take. That's it? I feel the purpose of the Hound could have been a lot better served had the culprit been anyone but her. Like maybe if Jason had some long-lost friend who had their own motive, and maybe they wanted to frame Jason as well as Scooby. That could have probably led to a better structured outcome. But even if her plan did follow through and Scoob was taken away for good, did she really think the outcome was going to be that perfect? She thought everything was going to end up exactly as she wanted? That no one was going to be negatively affected by this? With this kind of planning, I can't help but think she had a few screws loose when she came up with this. Especially as she thought the gang would have been better off without Scoob. We've already seen through one vision of how that could potentially turn out, and, well, let's just say it's not a pretty picture.
Oh, no!
It's a shame the Hound had to lack so much in the end. It offered so much potential for most of its runtime, and on top of that, the episode it came from also happens to be the episode that introduced Professor Pericles, the big criminal mastermind behind the show's story. But this ranking's supposed to be more based on the villains themselves, so that point doesn't really matter. And while this thing may have had a flat reveal, the Hound itself still gave us a decent presentation in the end. The Manticore. Given the variety of villains we've seen in this show, it's surprising they didn't take more of an advantage of the flying villain concept. I mean, yeah, this was a decent example of what they could have done with it, though maybe not great, but it still could have gone worse too. The flying was definitely a main feature of the Manticore, and you know, it got a pretty decent advantage out of it. Leading to surprise attacks and swooping from practically anywhere, it even gives it a chance to go as far as to lift its victims off the ground, and then right after sending them falling straight to their doom. Well, okay, that's also thanks to the added strength. And that has a more hit-or-miss outcome. Sometimes the mana core strength can lead to pretty impressive attacks, while other times the mana core just seems to abruptly lose its muscle by convenience. But a bit more of a memorable detail it had was its location. The mana core had an unusually chosen, but still pretty unique hideout. It had an entire ancient-themed temple and a carnival, and that on its own looked pretty neat too. While the mana core's actual routine wasn't anything too special, its mystery was still decently tied together with one of the bigger red herring / culprit pairings the show could offer, consisting of Winslow and Hot Dog Water, or as she's also known as, Marcy. While together, they both seemed like they could have been involved given their appearances and possible tech skills, although it just turned out to be Marcy behind this. And while it was pretty neat she was able to do all this by herself, her motive just didn't really make that much sense. And sure, some of the other culprits in the show had some rather silly forms of reasoning themselves, but even after a few rewatches, I still don't see what exactly Marcy was trying to go for. She did all this because she was trying to outdo Velma? Because she was lonely? Because she wanted to get more metal for her experiments? Like, what was her plan here? But all that aside, there's one little detail which I'm sure some of you may know by now, and even if not, then you might find it somewhat interesting. As I myself recently found out, Marcy's voice was done by Linda Cardellini, who was also known for incidentally playing Velma in the live-action movies too, which makes her fate working with Velma later in the show feel brilliant. And yeah, it may be obvious this was intended, it just seemed too good to be a coincidence. But either way, this path was a great touch added to help build her up for later. It managed to help her grow as a character, but I'll go more into that in later segments. So in some ways, the mana core played out fairly decent. While maybe not the best first impression to give Marcy, she still makes up for it by getting a chance to play another villain later in the show. And it thankfully comes out to be a bit more of a step up. But we've still got a bit more to go till we actually reach that point. The Fish Freaks. One of these underwater beasts can make a pretty decent threat on their own, but a whole group together? Now that's gonna be a pretty good scare for anyone. Their atmosphere at Dead Man's Point can already look haunted enough, but seeing these guys outnumbering and attacking any local being sailing by? That can lead to a nicely menacing combo there. And not only that, they even proved out the strength to go after victims on land too. Well, mostly on shore, but still, that shows they have more of an advantage than you may have thought at first. And the threat they showed us played through even better when you see how many victims they had captive on the oil platform. This is definitely one of those mysteries that had a higher number of victims, which definitely help add some layering to the freaks themselves, which seems like it could be very promising, but then we have the motive, which admittedly comes off more confusing than I thought they were going for. I'm not exactly sure what Ernesto and his team had in mind here. Like, yeah, this was partially for money, but I guess this was supposed to be some kind of Watchmen thought process too? Like the attempt to destroy something is the start to fixing it? And they thought this would help their environmental case for some reason? I don't really follow.
I just don't get that.
And yeah, I know the show had quite a few culprits with goofy or nonsensical motives for comic effect. That I get. And for the most part, those kinds of culprits played out with a structure that helped give them a more doable closure. But considering that these guys appeared in an earlier episode, and they were like this back then too, while playing off a motive at this level, it just gives off a bit of an impression that they were more so meant to be taken seriously? So these guys may have had one of the looser structure motives and with hardly any payoff, though they still had a fairly impressive presentation to help make their atmosphere come off more stable, and thus giving them a bit more of a boost here. Danny Darrow. While writing the layout for this ranking, I was heavily debating whether or not to include him in. I mean, he wouldn't exactly fit the typical Scooby-Doo premise. He's nothing more than just a human villain. He doesn't really have a costume or anything. But in regards to the show's story, he was surprisingly very impactful. In some ways, this wouldn't have felt the same without him. Plus, Cole seemed pretty interested in Darrow after I brought it up with him, so I guess he's in. So congrats, Darrow, you've earned your own spot in the ranking. So anyway, this guy was certainly one of those villain types that really stood out more than others. Probably the biggest reason being that he was a villain that managed to pull off an eerie monster-esque presentation without the need of a costume. Yeah, everything you see from him, that's his natural look. This is one of those instances where simplicity for a culprit's atmosphere can really go a long way. And that's just the start. While his appearance required little to no effort, his atmosphere was quite the opposite, as his hideout consists of an underground mansion where he spent all his time waiting for the gang to arrive and fight for their lives through a series of risky traps in every room. You know, kind of like something you might see in a Saw movie.
You don't know me, but I know you.
play a game.
And his variety in traps gives the impression that he's a lot smarter than he may seem. Although it's also fair to debate that might just be a case of insanity, given that a huge base point for his routine started from a misunderstanding.
My treasure! I thought you had returned to steal it!
Returned? I think you have us confused with the original Mystery Inc.
And I'll admit, it was kind of a shame that he didn't really have any big failsafe in the end. Like, after everything he put the gang through, you'd think he'd have one last big threatening trick up his sleeve. Like something bigger than everything else, something that he knows for a fact will definitely do them in. But without something like that, his simplicity starts to feel a bit more like a weakness that he could have easily avoided. But I'd still say a lot of what we've seen from him definitely makes up for it. Everything he put the gang through without the need of a mask or illusions of the supernatural to keep him hidden, and with just his own schemes and paranoia alone, he still pulled off a decently impressive mystery and made for a unique villain. And above all, he helped out the gang by explaining the planispheric disc and providing them with the first piece, which gave them their starting push down one of the biggest story arcs in the whole show, making him a very important staple to the show itself. And sure, he may not have had as huge of an outcome in the end as some villains, but on the other hand, his natural behavior, legit motive, and creative outcomes still made him a rather unique villain. And honestly, seeing all the potential and everything he offered, I would have loved to have seen at least one more human villain like him, just to see what else they could have come up with from this kind of concept. The Hodag of Horror. As far as animal-based villains go, this is one of the most realistic and impressive examples we ever got. But then again, they kinda cheated in that regard, but I'll go more into that in a bit. Sure, this kind of concept may have been done before in past generations, with a statue or some kind of frozen, fossilized creature coming to life and wreaking havoc on everyone and everything around them. But still, I feel they find ways to pull it off and make it look interesting, and this is definitely no exception. And bonus points for the design's accuracy and details, which, as I've recently learned, this thing is an actual mythological creature. And as far as I know, this was the first time they used a Hodag in this franchise, and they knew how to sell the presentation. Well, for the most part anyway. Despite the uniquely threatening appearance, this thing just didn't live up to its potential. It was all bark and no bite. Or all bark and looked like it was gonna bite but never fall through. Seriously, there were some pretty intense scenes we got from the Hodag, where it looked like there was gonna be some kind of actual suspense, but they never led to anything besides a bit of theft. I wouldn't mind it that much if they didn't add the unnecessary tension to these kinds of scenes, because it just made the outcome feel like a bit of a letdown. On top of that, they kept using that same outcome to the point where it was just getting old. Though there was still some strength in this thing's mystery, there were some brief implications showing that it could either be Gene or the Cheesemakers. And even when they get to the reveal, there's still more surprises to unfold.
Oh, monkey!
Yeah, like I said, it was a bit of a cheat, but still done in a creative way, so I'll let it slide. But still, the Hodag was generally just an kind of villain. It had a pretty strong start on the execution, but then it kind of started falling apart over time. Alice May, or the Ghost Girl. So Alice herself is supposed to be some kind of big stable in the show's story, or at least I think she is. There are some parts of her that are just too unclear. And I'll get to those in a moment, but first I have to get the first of her villains out of the way, the Ghost Girl. With this villain's atmosphere, she was mostly... She had some decent bits, but still wasn't all that amazing. Unfortunately, she decided to spoil the twist to her mystery by letting out the reveal in her first scene. Sure, the mystery can still stand since the gang doesn't know about this, but we do, and this just takes away a good portion of the satisfaction that we could have had. I feel her opening scene could have worked the way it was shown, if it was presented in more of a Jekyll and Hyde kind of style, making it look like she was unwillingly changing and then maybe planting fake evidence to make it look like it was actually someone else behind it. Kinda like with the Ghost of Hyde back in the original show. Sure, it still might not do much in some regard, but I feel this could have helped with Alice's layering, both with her mystery and potentially her character in general. But thankfully, she still manages to give us some interesting details and saving graces, with one of the biggest examples being that her mystery ties in with the Creeper. And those of you who've already seen my previous Scooby-Doo ranking already know how much I loved him. And besides, there are still one or two parts of her mystery on its own that happen to catch my attention. Like, where was she hiding all the guys she was capturing? And why is she doing this? And even though she does tell us why, it still turns out to be fake in the end. And besides that, we never seem to learn that much else about Alice herself, except for the fact that she's secretly working for Mr. E. And that's kind of a shame. Seeing how fleshed out the show was with its lore, you'd think they could have given some backstory to Alice too, but we never got anything from her. Thankfully though, this isn't the only time we get to see her. She ends up coming back with a far better villain atmosphere, which we'll get to in due time. The Ghost Truck. Well, to say the least, this sounds like on paper, it had the chance to be one of the blandest villains they could have come up with. But thankfully, that's not entirely the case. Sure, it's still a strange choice for a villain when compared to, well, pretty much all the others. Like, you've got all these people in costumes or with robots, then we have this giant truck among them, and, you know, it's a truck in general. That was already gonna make it an odd sort of choice. But it still offers enough details to come off kinda interesting too. Possessed vehicles can have the potential to be interesting if approached right, and it's not like the franchise is no stranger to this kind of concept. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us remember that episode of What's New Scooby-Doo where we had the possessed mystery machine. But even still, I'd have to say I found the truck to be more interesting, given its more unique design and threatening atmosphere. And besides, if we've learned anything from Sonic Adventure 2, big trucks can be menacing on their own anyway. And this one could probably give Sonic a run for his money too. Though, on the other hand, I feel there was a bit more they could have done with this truck. It may have had some nice details on its own, with the spooky look and the sounds and the flames coming off it as it drives at raging speeds and appearing in and out of the fog. To say the least, the aesthetic was great. But they could have also done a bit more to make it feel more like a threat. Like maybe have some weapons coming off it, like buzzsaws or something like that. Or maybe even have some holographic ghosts or something to help enhance the ghostly effect even further. But instead, the main attack it has was simply shoving its victims around. Maybe off the side of the road if it was lucky. And that's pretty much it. But at its most, it had a great chase scene to show what it's fully capable of, which helped make the truck a lot more memorable. And even on the side, this truck's mystery introduced us to Avocados and his potential as a red herring, while the actual culprit, Ladderton, gave us a decent routine without that much of a hassle. And what we were left with was definitely one of the strangest, but still one of the most visually interesting and physically biggest villains in the show. Lord Infernus. One trope that made the show stand out from others was that it had some villains with the power of attacking people in dreams. And this guy was a decent first example. While not amazing, I thought the other dream villains we got from the show were more interesting, Infernus still came out kinda neat in the end. Right off the bat, because he's in a dream, he's capable of pulling off more than the average villain. His plan was interesting, to say the least. In one fell swoop, he captured all the mystery gangs and turned them into guinea pigs. Okay, it's an oddly specific idea for a curse, I suppose? But he did put in some decent effort to make their replacements look convincing. And his fire static was also a great help with the presentation, when it comes to appearing, disappearing, and it makes for handy ammo. But still, there were other aspects that should have been given the same kind of effort, like how the culprit, the Funky Phantom, straight up vanished the exact same moment Infernus shows up, and Funky's never seen again after that. That just made him way too obvious. And keep in mind, he's a ghost. You'd think he might know some more clever ways to go around this. But still, there were a few other small details that helped make up for it. Like his motive, as silly as it was, it still made a bit of sense, given that we're dealing with obscure Hanna-Barbera characters. So Infernus was mostly alright. I still feel the other dream villains were more interesting, but he was still very much doable for the start of this unique and surprisingly powerful concept. The Fiend. As far as villain routines go, this guy had probably one of the most impressive executions, and all with the most laid-back effort at the same time. So the Fiend's shown to bring a curse to his library, causing all the guests to be haunted by a variety of hallucinations, all quite insane, but also rather creative. It mostly feels like the kind of stuff you might see in The Shining, only not as extreme. Nevertheless, these hallucinations still make quite the scene. There were quite a lot of examples that go from interesting and shocking and sometimes scary, and sometimes just straight up weird in general. And then you got the culprit, Dan Fluke. All he had to do, aside from putting the costume together, was a simple act of sabotage, by simply drugging the guests with a special firewood. Yeah, it may sound weird, I know, but it still goes a long way. Though going back to the laid-back routine I mentioned, it may help make the routine a lot easier in some ways, but at the same time it also kinda takes away from the impression of the Fiend itself. Like with its heavily limited screen time, it's easy to forget it was even there in the first place, especially with these crazy, over-the-top hallucinations coming up all over. Personally, I feel Fluke would have been a bit more credible here if he used some of his free time to slip on the costume a bit more often and give the Fiend a few more appearances. Yeah, there are still a few appearances from the Fiend, but they're mostly just very scarce pop-ups. This is probably just me, but I feel the Fiend could have left a bigger impression if we got to see more of it. This could have helped remind us that the Fiend itself actually exists, and it would help boost the implication that it's supposed to be the cause of its own mystery. But at least Flunk still had some decent stuff going for him, like Dean Fank and the chef serving as red herrings to help him blend in more. And Flunk also had his uniquely friendly, to sometimes quirky persona, which actually helped make him a bit more memorable as a culprit. And on top of that, said persona was boosted up by the ever so charming Kevin Michael Richardson. But to me, the best thing about Flunk was his motive. I'm sure a lot of us can relate to the feeling of being stuck in the same place for years at a time, and how much of a negative impression it can leave on just about anyone's mental health. Like having to keep the same job for so long, or just being in some kind of place that doesn't give you much of a chance at leaving, or maybe just feeling like you're stuck in place metaphorically. I'm sure this is something we all felt in some way at least once in our lives, and so maybe a lot of us can understand what he was going through. Although, even with his endearing motive, there was still another villain who I thought had a bit more of an impressive routine in general, who we'll get to later. But mind you, this didn't stop the Fiend from leaving a pretty neat impression of its own. The Headless Horror. Sure, we may have had plenty of other headless villains from other generations in the franchise, be it before or after this show, but this one already deserves bonus points for the unique design. Instead of fancy dressing and a missing head like they usually go for, they decided this thing should have a different look altogether. An ancient tribal kind of look with a face across the torso.
Oh my god, plot twist, his eyes are really his nipples the whole time!
And on top of that, just like with the Hodag of Horror, they took inspiration on this thing's design based on a mythical being, which this thing is usually called a Blemye? Hopefully I'm saying that right? I'm not too sure. But yeah, they gave us something new this time, and it played out fairly decent here. And the presentation greatly adds on to this, as this thing has its own ruins on standby for a hideout, as well as the separate talking head. Man, these kinds of details made for quite an interesting spin on the creep factor. I'll admit, I wasn't expecting to be this weirded out when I saw it, and I like that. But the one factor that brings this thing down is its motive. Yeah, I suppose in some ways it can feel a little endearing how Marion would go this far in an attempt to ensure Rick's safety, but she never stops to think that she herself might be hurting him, or leading him to something that could potentially kill him? It's times like these where we have to ask, do these kinds of culprits actually know what they're doing? Have they thought this far ahead? And no, these are legit questions, I'm not necessarily being mean here, although I'd be lying if I said this kind of motive didn't feel a little frustrating at times. But on the other hand, I can kinda see where Marion's coming from. Partially feeling that Rick cares more about adventuring than her, that on its own could be enough to make her reasonably mad in this regard. And at least she still had plenty of advantages to her as well, like most of the resources being there in the open for her to help save time for her planning, as well as working alongside Kachinga, who made a pretty good red herring himself. And even if some of her attack decisions still came off a little questionable, at least I can say Marion gave us a rather impressive performance in many different ways. Junk. Now, don't let the name fool you, it's not completely junk, though I mean, yeah, that's its name, and that's what it's made of, but there's actually a bit more to it than meets the eye. Right out of the gate, its uniquely fluent animation against the show's usual style helped it stand out more visually, and at the same time it wasn't being pushed to such a degree where the style would start to feel more obnoxious, even though it could potentially have felt that way. So in the end we got a more balanced visual style, so that's a nice touch already. The whole presentation itself also helped make this thing more memorable. What starts off as a literal junk heap can merge into a giant, intriguingly designed robot, and with a few nifty features on the side. Its heightened speed can make it menacing in some ways, but the fact that it only has two main weapons can make its attacks a little too predictable, as well as more easy to escape in some situations, which can come off kinda disappointing given the potential of this thing. Maybe if it had the power to stick more weapons to itself and maybe get bigger and stronger with each new addition, that could have made it more interesting. But regardless, I'd still say it was interesting enough based on what we got. And to top this thing off, it's shown that it can turn its victims into gold.
I love gold!
And it ends up with more than one victim, which makes its mystery more of a decent challenge to pin down a suspect. Well, except for Randy perhaps. Given his starky and stubbornly creative nature and his attachment to junk, and the fact that he made him in the first place, he had enough factors against him to make him a decent red herring. But what I think is the coolest thing about junk was the routine planned by the real culprit. Hans turning his guitar into a remote for the robot was quite a surprise. But hey, I guess that's science for you.
Wow, science is so amazing!
His motive might have been a little ridiculous, and in some ways, surprisingly ridiculous, but there were plenty of culprits in this show who had a silly factor to their motives too. And the fact that these come from more personal matters helps give them a bit more of a leg to stand on. Plus, Hans managed to hint at his motive in a pretty smart way too, which shows there was more planning to him than expected. So while this was a fairly cool robot-esque villain, I'd still say there were better in this franchise, like Charlie for example, who I'd still say has more charm and memorability, but fear not folks, Charlie will be coming back soon enough. But okay, now I'm starting to get ahead of myself. The Kriegstaffelbots and Abigail Gluck. The Kriegstaffelbots themselves have gotta be one of the more dangerous, and even one of the darkest villains we got from the show, right down to their atmosphere. These things are essentially World War II robots. And I'm not exaggerating that. There are implications and even some moments where they straight up address that's what they were going for. These things can come off pretty ruthless. They're armed, they can show up anywhere at any point, and to top it off, there were multiple times they put the gang in highly life-risking situations. God, this is one of those threats that really lives up to the title as a threat. These things can come off as a threat even in their craziest of moments.
I have several questions.
No, I have to say, I'm not completely sure what was the exact plan for Gluck here. Sure, there may have been some effort put in these holograms, and it does make sense that Pericles probably made her look like this as an obstacle solely for the gang and maybe even to get Cassidy out of the way, and that's a smart move on his end. I'd even say this specific kind of planning would have been used to greatly improve some other villains, like the Horrible Herd. And seeing her the first few times can leave a pretty strong impression, but seeing her pop up again and again after a while, especially knowing she commands these bots, that kinda takes away from the interesting eerie element she had at first. Yeah, it still makes her a little menacing, but unfortunately not as ghostly as before. Honestly, it was the Kriegstaffelbots that helped boost the spotlight on both of them. Especially when we learn what they did to Cassidy. Oh god.
The arms of the angel fly away from here, from this dark old hotel room, and the endlessness that you feel.
These robots had a pretty big and long-lasting effect, even outside of this episode, as they practically serve as extra minions to serve Pericles afterward, and delivered a heft of fear in the show's atmosphere. Chargar Gothicon. So, quick question. Are you a Cthulhu fan? If you are, then you're gonna love this guy. And even if you're not, well, there's still a chance you'll find something to like about him, as I certainly did myself. So yeah, it's pretty obvious this guy is a Cthulhu clone, right down to his creator. Only here, they called him Hatecraft. And, yeah, alright, it's clever enough, I suppose. So it may not seem like it at first, but this guy is quite a powerhouse. You can see there was a lot of thought put into the costume when it came to the mechanics. From the tentacles in his hands and his face, and there's also his blasting screech. I tell you, this is one guy you don't want to get in the way of. And much unlike with Night Fright, where he was portrayed for a desperate promotional stunt by the creator himself, this guy was portrayed by a diehard fanboy of the creator, which both comes off a bit more sensical and adds on a nice twist to his mystery. And while on the topic of the culprit, Howard chose a great place to strike. While on campus, he could blend in with so many people that looked like they could have been possible suspects too, especially with all the people Hatecraft had connections with there. Whether or not it was intentional, that was still pretty smart on Howard's end. But there were still some choices he made that were kinda questionable. Like he went as far as to make an impression to try and kill Hatecraft? Even though his entire motive was to defend him this whole time?
But when Hatecraft admitted he made it up?
That's when he had to fall. And he would have too, if it weren't for the dark elder forces conspiring in the inky black of time most foul.
Okay. Sure, it's fair to say he was getting carried away, but do you really think someone like him would go this far and try to go this violent? I like to think that he was just getting too invested in the role to the point where it started to consume him, which kinda sounds like the premise for another horror story on its own. And if that's what they were trying to go for, that makes for a more unique and interesting turn of events. Like Howard would have essentially lost his favorite author thanks to his own hands, had this all played out how he, or the costumed form of he, wanted. I'll admit I was never that much of a Lovecraft fan growing up, and I still wouldn't say I'm that much nowadays, but I can kinda see a bit of the appeal in his writings through this thing now.
Please! Please!
The White and Red Wizards. Despite giving off a slightly similar impression that the Humongonauts gave us, their own impression was still way more interesting. Just like the Humongonauts, their presentation gave off the impression of two supernatural beings fighting neck and neck for two different sides of chaos and evil. But this time, there was a twist that the Red Wizard, who turns out to be Chen, was actually helping the gang. Well, more specifically, he was fighting for good on his end to rightfully protect his treasure, the Jade Dragon. The White Wizard was the true villain here, trying to snatch it. But the way they portrayed these guys was still very clever. Despite the Red Wizard secretly working with the good guys, they still played him off in ways that made him come off as quite a threat, which helped enhance his mystery for both the characters and us the audience. And it's because of that I feel he deserves as much credit as the White Wizard in this ranking, even with his intentions. Besides that, their fight scene was way more fascinating than the Humongonauts. They were more visually appealing with their lightning effects and their flying mechanics and the fight choreography. This kind of stuff helped give more action and impressive details. And the main culprit, Mr. Wang, happened to be voiced by the iconic George Takei, who I'm sure we all recognize by his voice at least.
Oh my.
The only downside I can think of with the White Wizard is that he was taken down a little too quickly and easily. After everything he gave us alongside the Red Wizard, you'd think he might have been able to see this coming or put up some kind of fight, but no, apparently the cage was enough to finish him off. Which, yeah, was a bit of a letdown, but I'd still say these two were some of the most impressive wizards we've seen in this franchise. The Crybaby Clown. Both the first villain in Season 2, and the first costume villain to get more than one episode. So already this guy was breaking some new ground for the show. That's a good start. So the clown's premise, plain and simple, he's a clown who starts off spreading chaos and fear throughout the town. Kinda reminds you of someone, doesn't it? And it's kind of funny I bring that up, as, just like the Joker, this guy was also voiced by Mark Hamill.
Oh, Lexi, I'm hurt. How could you have this little party without inviting me?
It's not a party.
You know what makes me sad? All these empty seats. Oh, I wish I had enough friends to fill this entire plane.
So in the first half of his act, he was, alright. He gave us enough of a sample to show what he's capable of and what kind of tricks he has in store and what kind of devices he's using, like his carriage car, his bottle grenades, and his,
That's a dirty diaper bomb!
Wow, thanks. I did not need to see that. But despite the structure of his introduction, at least he was arranged well enough to show us his basics. But even still, he seemed a little disorganized at first, especially when compared to his second attack spree. I feel his first act would have been better balanced if he gave one or two slight hints foreshadowing on what his plan was gonna be, which could have left the viewers to think more on what he was going on about. And then when he returned, it would all start to click together. But his next spree makes up for it regardless, as the clown resorts to kidnappings and even hijacking a whole plane. And he puts up a decent fight in the end too. Or better than some other villains we saw on the show at least. So in general, I had some mixed feelings about this guy. Some of his choices may have been a little questionable, and the culprit was starting to become a little obvious as he started capturing all the other possible suspects. But he was still very eventful during his crime spree. He had a few memorable lines and moments, and again, he had the voice of Mark Hamill. How could you go wrong with him? So yeah, he was still a decent start to Season 2, and a decent villain in general. The Mayan Priestess. Well, here's the last costume villain we got from the show, and while it was a pretty great adventure for what was this close to the show's end, there were still a few issues that came off with the Priestess in general. Like, one thing that dragged her down throughout her routine was the system I referred to as the Kingston method. Going back to Elias Kingston in the original show, he had his own unique wrath that looked threatening enough on its own. And that impression can leave a pretty good impact until you see only one person fall victim to it, while literally everyone else has an easier time getting away from that. Only for that one victim to end up being the culprit themselves. That same method has been used on a handful of villains over time, as well as the Priestess, as we can see. And in my opinion, all this really does in the end is make the reveal more predictable and faster than I can tell they were going for. Which kinda does weigh down the mystery a little. Especially because there's an easy way to jump this method by simply adding another victim. By having more than one person, or maybe someone who's not the culprit end up being a victim, that can really help raise the stakes in one's mystery. But I'll go more into that in a later segment. Though I will say there are a few details to the priestess to help add more of a bright side to her too. There were a few red herrings centering around her routine to help even out the playing field. Like that unusual agent who's been following them around, and even Enrique's wife, who had the right kind of energy and attitude to make it look like she might have been hiding something suspicious herself.
Angie Dinkley, the temptress who has stolen my Enrique!
Maybe even something related to the mystery. Who would have known? But even if her presence wasn't as noticeable here, that still didn't stop the priestess herself from giving off some interesting attacks with her supernatural vines. Seeing them appear at just about anywhere and move as she desires and tying up her victims, that can really leave an impression that's not so easy to mess with. That as well as her heavily trap-filled temple to hide in. It's fitting for her atmosphere and makes it more of a challenge to find her. As for the reveal, while Enrique's motive may have been unnecessarily extreme, it does help show a somewhat sweet side to him too, which I'll admit kinda helps him stand out a little bit more.
And I would have gotten away with it too if you had really loved me.
So while there was a surprising mashup with big upsides and downsides in the priestess details, her impression was still big enough and fascinating enough for me to put her in the top half of the ranking. Maybe not too high, but still at a decent spot to solidly stand her place. Baba Yaga. If nothing else, I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with the sole concept of Baba Yaga. Originating from Russian lore, she was a witch with a legged house and sometimes known to have a vicious urge to chase down her victims. Now that already sounds like a villain layout that could have given off quite an impression, and for the most part, it was delivered fairly well. Maybe not ideal, but still pretty great. Her introduction, while nothing new, still gives off a neat first impression. The idea that a common life-size museum exhibit of that nature can abruptly come alive and start some harmful mayhem? I always found that to be a factor that can admittedly come off a little chilling, but rather impressive too. And Vronsky was certainly on the smarter side when it came to the average culprit in the show. He planned ahead and made so the house could move at his control. And on top of that, he had the house's remote conveniently and cleverly hidden, so he could use it with ease and those around him would be none the wiser. And not only that, he also used the advantage of having Anna captured to make it seem like she might have been more involved with this routine. By making it so she was easily captured while everyone else was a bit of a struggle, that could have easily made it look like she would have been the culprit. This was a fairly solid instance when the Kingston method actually worked in Vronsky's favor. It's a very rare scenario for the culprit to have a planned captive aside from themselves. It gives them a great advantage to help with their cover from both the characters and us the viewers. Though, going back to the house, its presentation can be a blessing, as well as a curse for the overall impression. Yeah, I still think it looks great, but one big problem that comes off it is how much it overshadows what's supposed to be the main threat in this mystery, Baba Yaga. At best, there's maybe one or two scenes where Baba Yaga herself shows off some great potential, while the rest of the attacks and screen time end up giving more of a spotlight to just the house. And honestly, that just makes it a bit harder to remember whether Baba was even there in that scene at all. And remember, Vronsky only went out in full costume as a last resort while fixing the house, instead of trying to advance on the impression of Baba Yaga. That kinda tells us that had this incident never happened, that would have just made Baba Yaga herself more underplayed and maybe even more forgettable by that point. Really, I just wish we got to see a few more attacks from her in general, cause the few things we've seen from her were, admittedly, just as neat as what the house could offer sometimes. But even with that in mind, Baba Yaga was still a pretty fascinating addition to these mysteries. And she had some things about her as a whole that made her come off as a rather awesome trait at times. So now let's move forward, on to the third female villain in a row. Dark Lilith. So this was Marcy's second chance at playing a costume villain, and I think it's fair to say she's certainly learned a lot since her last routine. This routine may not be completely different from her Manor setup, as she's going for another flying monster, but the way I see it, it feels like she made this choice to show off the improvement she made from last time. And if that's what she or the writers were actually going for, I think that's a pretty nice move. But nevertheless, there were still some pretty solid improvements she gave us this time around. With a slightly more memorable and quite appealing design choice, the way this character talks and rhymes, which may not be as big an impact on her, but it still shows a bit more of a creative touch to the character here. She's got some good flight attacks and strength upon flight to help show a decently threatening side as well. Not forgetting the factor she has the strength to supposedly move a whole ship now. Dang, Marcy, you've been working on the muscle hard there. Nicely done! On top of that, now that Marcy's character had a bit more of a chance to get fleshed out, her motive actually makes a bit more sense this time. With the time she spent working with Mystery and away from Velma, you can kind of feel a bit more of the sympathy in her this time and see where she's coming from. The routine itself may have had a slightly similar structure to what the Graveyard Ghoul had, with a main red herring having a little too close a call to the transitioning standpoint, but this time the detail was a lot stronger, as it was held up by more choices of a red herring to go through. Like you had the most likely choice, Granny Snaggletooth, and heck, just about anyone in her family seemed fairly plausible as suspects in her mystery too. Though I guess looking back on this, the fact that Marcy's voice this time wasn't quite so well hidden, at least when compared to when she was the Manticore, that should have been a bit of a giveaway that it was her. But with her performance and routine, and with the different details added to help boost the mystery, that all helped make it easier to forget about and lead to me thinking about, well, all these other details. While this definitely was Marcy's better routine out of the pair, I still feel the other villains were coming on next had more intriguing details to offer. Although, that still didn't stop Marcy from leaving a great staple on the show's story. The Obliteratrix. The second costume villain that Alice May has provided for the show, and this one was quite a step up from her first villain attempt. She gave a pretty big entrance right out of the gate. And while this wasn't as creepy as her Ghost Girl concept, she still shows she's a force to be reckoned with in this form. She's got a whole bunch of tricks at her disposal which are pretty neat, but on the surface level they're nothing more than just your average illusions. But she still gives off enough of the real deal this time to show her worth. With her expert agility, her physical combat skills, and her weapon variety, and even still, her magic stunts were also arranged well enough to give off the impression she was trying to go for in her attacks. Be it for a sneak entrance and escape route, or just for total destruction. Man, she's definitely improved on her planning from when we last saw her, and just like with Howard and Gothicon, her timing couldn't be any better, as she had plenty of red herrings at her convenience over at the campus all laid out for her, including a few extra direct possibilities, which really helped boost her mystery in general. But the only issue I kinda had with her was similar to an issue Alice had the first time around. During her time in the show, it felt like they were gonna do something big and special with her at some point in the story, but we never really get to see that. But again, that's mostly just a personal thing and doesn't greatly affect her placing itself, but I still feel like there's a lot missing to her. Like, yeah, we know she's working for Mystery, but why? What did she herself have to gain by doing all this? And not just the start of her unanswered questions. Like, what was she like as her own person? What's her life like?
Tell me more about this super hot Obliteratrix girl. Is she, single?
Stone! For God's sake, you don't know her age! Well, then again, it doesn't seem like anyone else does. Which was another answer we should have gotten from her. Was she really a high school kid? Or was she older than that and just trying to sneak around the gang? But even with all these things we might never find out about Alice May, at least she managed to make an impressive rebound through the impression of the Obliteratrix. Dead Justice, or Iron Will Williamson.
Stick 'em up, partners. There's a new undead sheriff in town, and he's got a lot to offer.
In general, this guy gives us the typical cowboy aesthetics, but with some rather interesting twists to them, like his lightning lasso, and he's greatly armed with ghostly shark bullets, and he even comes with his own supernatural horse included. Plus he's got his own ghost fog to enhance his entrances and exits, just like with the ghost truck, but needless to say, Dead Justice made it look much cooler. I was also willing to give some bonus points for his backstory. It's not often this show would go this far with a villain's backstory, and especially this extreme with it too. Not gonna lie, this guy actually came off awesome. The culprit Bucky was also surprisingly smart to play this off when the Night Ranger was starting to get some attention, so that way he wouldn't have come off like some out-of-nowhere red herring. So yeah, there was certainly some decent effort and planning that was put into this guy, but like a few other villains from before, I feel the way they took him down was a little off. Like he couldn't tell that Nitro was gonna be fake too? Bucky, you were dressed up as one of these fighters, and it never crossed your mind that this was also a guy in a costume? But besides that, he still had so many neat details that I say it makes up for that one slip-up. And on top of that, I'm just glad Dead Justice was brought to light regardless. His existence helped give Sheriff Stone more of a reason to get involved with the mystery solving that didn't resort to any overly unnecessary desperation. You know, like what we got with the Alien Trio. Sure, we may have seen a few cowboy-esque villains before in the franchise, but this guy's gotta be one of the most impressionable examples we ever got. But I just have one question. What was up with that piranha goat? Aphrodite. Whoa, since when did the Joker have a sister? So assuming we all learned a thing or two about Greek mythology at least once in our lives, we're all familiar with the name Aphrodite as the goddess of love. She's come to Crystal Cove in this form, ready to strike just in time for Valentine's Day, as she... Wait, what? This wasn't a Valentine's Day special? Well, that was a missed opportunity. So Aphrodite's attacking Crystal Cove with a quick-spreading love chemical that contains effects of mind control. They always find ways to fling it back to me. I'm just gonna try to breeze over that factor for the time being, if you folks don't mind. But joking aside, I gotta give some credit to Aphrodite. The fact that she was able to take over the town in such a short amount of time is actually kind of impressive. And I bet her dedication to this whole plan must mean she has just as good closure. Surely she must have a strong motive if she was gonna go this far in the first place, right?
Wrong.
Well, that's mostly up for debate. As we find out from the culprit, Amanda Scythe, her goal this whole time was to get payback as she dealt with some prom humiliation years before, where they gave her the mask, which ended up to be Aphrodite's face. But this does raise a few questions. Like, if the mask was that much of a problem in the first place, couldn't she have just taken it off? On top of that, don't you think at least one person would have recognized that face? At least before they got drugged? Assuming that some residents that went to high school with her would still be living there? But I still found her to be a memorable, enjoyable villain as a whole, leaving an Invasion of the Body Snatchers related impact on the show.
You fools! You're in danger! Can't you see? They're after you! They're after all of us! Our wives, our children, everyone! They're here already! You're next! You're next! You're next! You're next!
The Slime Mutant. This was the villain the gang ran into back in the first episode. And this guy was so neat! Maybe not jaw-dropping amazing, but he made a great first impression for this new generation. Not only did this guy have a threatening, but also appealing design, he played smart too. Encasing his victims in blobs of his slime, he took down various citizens while also creating a setup to make who turns out to be the culprit a victim too. And I always felt that kind of pairing had an excellent balance with this franchise. So right off the bat, this gives off a bit more of a challenge to solving the mystery. And going back to his appearance, it has a very underrated look to it. The visible skeleton was a unique touch, and the green shading helped make him more intimidating. As it turned out, the slime was actually Fruitmeyer's dessert. So this gave off the impression that Fruitmeyer could have been involved with the mystery too. But we find out he was just a red herring, who was cleverly thrown in, I might add. So with this interesting villain and the other story elements unfolding, this show's opening was powerful enough of a first impression to let the audience know what kind of show they were in for. The Gnome. You know, for a little guy, he gave off a pretty big surprise. He was certainly on the creepier side, to say the least, as his shorter structure gave him more of an advantage to sneak up on his victims, and his looks alone can be enough to scare people, but it doesn't stop there. Even despite his build, he's not so easy to get away from. He's got ace gymnast skills on his side to boost his speed, and he's able to paralyze his victims. Yikes! Put all this together in one person and you'll see how he can be frightening to some. Even the culprit, Gil Littlefoot, like plenty of other victims in this show, had his disguise played out fairly smart, but still in a few unique ways. By placing himself next to his highly aggressive wife, and planting evidence connected to her, and making stills to make himself look taller than the gnome, it would have been a lot harder to pinpoint him directly. As a side note, Gil happened to be voiced by someone else I recognize, being Jeffrey Tambor. Yeah, his voice worked fine for the character, but nevertheless, anyone who's familiar with his story from a couple years ago will more likely say,
"That one didn't age quite so well."
But at least Gil still pulled off the innocent guy routine in a decent enough way to throw everyone off. Not too obvious, and not too mysterious either. Just a decent midway balance. Sure, there are some who may think little of him, no pun intended, but I still found him to be one of the more threatening and unique villains the show could give us. With the impression he left, he certainly deserved to go in the top 10. The Mummy of Friar Sarah. It's fair for some to assume I may have a slight fascination for mummy-based villains in this franchise. I mean, I gave some pretty high regards to Anka in the first show. No! And this guy ended up pretty high too, and for just as good of reasons, I'd say. It was interesting enough that this guy's base came from the corpse of someone who had a strong connection to the planispheric disk and the mystery gang history in general. And as far as mummies go in these shows, this was certainly one of the most, if not the most unique design I've ever seen. It fits really nicely into the scary potential this kind of villain can have. It also helped that this guy was putting on a great performance to make it look like he was actually out for blood. The design alone would have done a pretty good job at that. Seeing this guy with his green, glowing, smoky aura, his skeletal structure, and face would have probably been enough to give a pretty good scare. But he took the extra step to greatly enhance his atmosphere. All through his entrances, exits, his strength, and flight. Well, okay, there's a little secret to that, which I'll get to in a bit. And the reveal definitely deserves some special credit, as it finally gave some closure to Avocado's story.
George Avocados?
That's oh, forget it.
Yeah, this may be the third time we've seen him now, but his suspicious atmosphere finally paid off by having him be the actual culprit this time around. So with a creative look and routine, a worthwhile culprit behind it, and with some neat twists around all that, particularly revealing that the goat's mummy form was the real deal this whole time, that on its own was freaking awesome. This all helped make him one of the most exciting villains we got to see, and they still find ways to get better from there too. The Freak of Crystal Cove. The last villain that Season 1 had to offer, and it was quite a send-off. Sure, his atmosphere may be a bit more simple than other villains we've seen before and after him, and he still could have stood to have a little more screen time in his episode, given his potential, but he still gave more value than meets the eye. At first glance, his appearance has a fair amount of creep factor, how he's able to sneak around everywhere, hide in the shadows and such. Heck, his appearance alone can be quite chilling to some, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. This guy was one of the few villains in the show with a long-term backstory. Specifically, his reign of terror goes back as far as the generation of the previous Mystery Gang. And I don't say this often, but even with the circumstances, the Freak gave us one of the most touching moments of the show. We get to see a villain save one of the good guys while still in costume. And this also leads to one of the biggest reveals the show could throw at us.
The Freak of Crystal Cove is my father.
Mayor Jones?
Oh yeah, he was behind this whole thing. And he was doing this to try and keep the disc safe, as well as trying to keep Fred safe from his real parents all this time.
You're adopted!
The Freak of Crystal Cove was a far more important staple than I was expecting when I first saw him, and he helped pave the road for a lot of other big story elements that would come into play in Season 2. The Man Crab. It may just be me, but I've noticed that the beach tends to offer a lot of potential for some really interesting villains in this franchise, and the Man Crab was no exception. Sure, the thought behind him may have come from a simple guy with an even more simple motive, but he made up for it by putting a lot of planning into this thing. The creative appearance already can give off a decent fear factor of its own, but he offers a lot more features than that. He's got extra legs that fit the crab theme and help enhance his speed. He's got added strength in the robot suit capable of destruction and letting him leap great distances. And he can even drag multiple victims in what could possibly be their sandy demise. Well, okay, he doesn't end up being that dark, but his presentation was still enough to give off an intensely menacing but rather exciting atmosphere. And the culprit, Bud Shelton, even took the extra step to plant some evidence to make it look like the one behind it would have been Skipper Shelton. So wait, is he in any way related to Bud? I'm not sure, they don't seem to go into that. But even if Bud's framing wasn't anything heavy duty, Skipper's atmosphere did make it look like he might have had some connection to the Man Crab, given his potential and his personality through first impressions in general.
What happened? I'll tell ye, boyo. That was a clam that took it. Fierce and mighty was he, and reduced me to wearing facial underwear he did.
It was enough that the limited effort on the framing still helped him go a long way. The Man Crab himself has got to be one of the best examples this franchise has given us that shows how far someone can go with some simple foundation, as well as extreme engineering, which obviously isn't as simple, but it still makes a very neat monster in the end. The Monstrous Freak. Now we're looking at the second of the dream villains from the trio, and this was quite the step up from Lord Infernus. Admittedly, his powers may not be anything too special, mostly just the common appearing and disappearing at will, although there's also a bit more of a vicious side to him, and an arcing story behind him too. But what really helped him balance out was his importance to the story and the impacts that came with him. Going back to the Freak of Crystal Cove, this guy's existence was the base inspiration for the mayor's design of the costume in the first place. And not only that, it's also implied this freak has some sort of impact on many others. Even though we never get to find out what exactly, the fact he was able to affect this many people in general shows how powerful he alone potentially is. On top of all that, probably the best thing the Monstrous Freak offered was his connections to the show's whole story. He was secretly Eligire this whole time and hiding himself after the effect of the big threat. And through this, we learn about the previous generations of the mystery gangs in between, leading all the way up to where they are now. And we even learn more about the keys and the hints of their intentional uses to get to the treasure once and for all. Whew, boy, that's quite a heft from this guy. So many answers given through this guy's routine, and along with his advantages of being in the dream world, all of this made him a hugely satisfying staple in the story for the show. But even with all that to unfold, there's one other dream intruder that I thought managed to outdo this guy, whom we're going into straight away. The Dreamweaver. He was the third dream-based villain we've seen now, and also my personal favorite of the trio. We've already had some pretty neat details coming from Lord Infernus and the Monstrous Freak, but this guy's still managed to top them in different ways. Like when compared design-wise, the Dreamweaver certainly had a more fashionable side to him. You can definitely feel a David Bowie vibe with this guy, specifically through his character Jareth, the Goblin King from Labyrinth. From the way they dress and talk, to some parts of their atmospheres, to their crystal balls, there's a lot of similarities between them. Now I'm sure some of you may remember I was singing the praises of Labyrinth long ago in a different video, so you might have probably expected that I'd be way on board with this type of villain trope. And you're right, his charm and creativity really went a long way, to the point where I found them to be a lot more impressive than the other dream villains in the show. His described origin sounds pretty unique too. He's a D&D character, or C&C in this case, implied to be slowly creeping out of the game and haunting those who had any interaction with him through their sleep. There he's most powerful and almost impossible to escape from. But to sum up the reason why I put him up this high in the ranking, I've narrowed it down to not one, not two, but 3 defining details that help make the Dreamweaver the best in this trio. For starters, Horbert Feist was the only human culprit out of the trio, while the others were just some type of ghost. Which, yeah, that led to some pretty interesting elements on their end, and it did make their effects and illusions more understandable, but this guy had the power of science and engineering on his end. He may have had to put in more effort, and yet he was still able to craft all this together. That's really cool. And alongside that, he played the routine off quite cleverly, by making the planned victims among him too go through the same effect. So that way he'd blend in with those he intended to have suffering the wrath. That kind of thinking helps him stray away from the Kingston method, which is always a smart move that I definitely admire from these culprits. And on top of all that, the effects he has on his victims are very powerful, to the point where the effects last even when they're awake, which leave an actual impact on the reality around them.
Oh my goodness, what did I say there?
This guy may have been freakier than the other dream villains, but at the same time he was equally awesome. And it was a great peek to a uniquely delivered villain trope that we got from the show. It kinda gets me hoping we'll get to see a bunch of villains like this in a future generation show of the franchise. But please, just don't let it get tarnished by that Velma show. Anything but that.
What the hell are you? No! No! No!
The Shadowy Figure. This thing's a lot like the Fiend, but a huge step up in almost every way. So many of its details played out really great. A great setup, great entrance, great atmosphere, great design, great execution of a plan, and a great routine all around. So the Shadowy Figures come to take over Joan's Manor and spread its fear by possessing practically every common object in any given room, including pizza! And that really helped give it its appeal, as opposed to the Fiend, where you know everything was just hallucinations, which debatably made him start feeling a little repetitive after some time. The Figure's wrath is shown through all these physical objects all throughout the house that could do just about anything, and even have a legit impact on the attacks, which shows a different form of creativity and a bigger form of a good threat. And the big reveal behind the Figure was definitely one of the biggest shockers. I doubt many people would have guessed that Pericles of all characters would have been the culprit for this thing. Like his routine with the Creek Staphobots may have been a little predictable in some ways, but here, try to imagine such a little guy being the skeleton of something with this unique structure and being able to control all of this happening all at once. Now that's an impressive feat for him. Like, I knew he was smart and all, but man! Sure, the sunflower seed should have made it enough of an obvious hint that he was the culprit for this, But given how random a lot of these other culprits can be, that could have just as easily been a clue for probably anything else. And as someone who has a habit of nitpicking and easily seeing through these kinds of elements sometimes, I'll admit this was one detail that actually managed to successfully get around me. So, good job on that. Though I still do wonder why these trap systems are connected to some of these things, and why for that matter, but knowing this side of Fred in the show, it's probably best to leave it unanswered. Who knows what other kind of secrets he may be holding on to.
I'm starting to feel like one of his traps.
Overall, this is certainly one of the best attempts Pericles has pulled off at finding the disc, all with a unique looking threat, and an incredibly wild ride to boost it all up. Rude Boy and the Ska-Tastics. Maybe it's just me, but I can't help but feel that ska's a very underrated music genre, and it's a bit of a shame we haven't gotten much of it in recent years. Thankfully, these boys swung by to change all that. Their entrance alone was enough to tell you that they had some impressive tricks in store, the biggest one being their song.
You did right, mates. You did right, mates. It's up night, mates. You did right, mates.
The song was rumored to unleash a curse on Crystal Cove, making all nearby citizens dance non-stop. But as it turns out, said curse was just a case of mind control. Which, like I said earlier, I'm trying to breeze over that detail for the time being. But even without the effect, who could blame them for dancing? This is one of the catchiest jams I've heard in a while. It's so great, it could stand a chance against the Hex Girl songs. And speaking of, guess who's back? This song was a major staple in the show as a whole. It really kicks. But wait, if I enjoyed a song this much, would that mean I'm a potential victim to the curse too? Oh no. But even if they didn't have their song, I guarantee you they still would have been very great and memorable. Maybe not as much, but I still would have put them in the top 10 at least, as they had other neat factors to them. For starters, who doesn't love a zombie motorbike chase? Not only can they rock a tune, but they can also rock on wheels. Another element to their mystery I enjoyed was the reveal, which had a kind of turnout I wasn't, and I doubt many were expecting. Rude Boy and the Ska-Tastics turned out to be Rude Boy and the Ska-Tastics. As it turned out, they went for the Captain Cutler routine by faking their own deaths, so no one would have suspected it was them, making you believe that these zombies could have been pretty much anyone else. Maybe it was Ian, or some of the doctors, who would have known? That's always been one of the smartest twists in the franchise. I'm surprised that hasn't been used more often. These guys were among the most underrated villains I've seen in this whole franchise, and I sure hope we get more music-based villains in future shows. Krampus. I believe Krampus in general needs no introduction. He's been an example for a symbol of Christmas morality for many years through many different presentations. And while I wouldn't say I'm too familiar with most of these versions, this version of the guy left an incredible impression, both on his premise and even the show as a whole. It's amazing at first to see how many surprises this guy carries. His tall muscular build, that thick club, heat vision, his shockingly nimble tongue, his breath making one's hair literally turn white with fear?
I have seen shit that'll turn you white.
Man, how can one person be able to use this many features all at once? Well, that's just it. It wasn't just one person. Or even a person for that matter.
Now, let's see who Krampus really is. Charlie the Haunted Robot!
Yeah, that's right. After so many years, that robotic icon Charlie got a proper spotlight again. And all thanks to the masterminds who planned this whole routine. The Mystery Inc. gang themselves. Yeah, I was greatly blown back by this surprise too. Unless I'm mistaken, this was the first time the gang were the main culprits in a mystery. And that on its own is big enough, but what about the motive? Why were they doing this in the first place? Well, to simply outsmart the old mystery gang and get the last of the disc pieces from them. To finally complete the planispheric disc once and for all. It felt really satisfying to finally see them have all the pieces and put the whole thing together. And on top of all that, there's so much revolving around Krampus here that shows the writers had a lot of care for the show's continuity. By including as many of the past culprits and red herrings as they possibly could in this thing's involvement, it really feels like they were proud of how far the story had gone by that point. And they decided to use Krampus' routine as a way of showing it. You can definitely feel a great sense of accomplishment with everything they did through Krampus. They could have easily made him the villain for a season finale, and I'd say he'd make great closure for that part of the show. His overall impression was one of the most clever and memorable villain routines I've seen from the show. But while I thought Krampus was brilliant in all these different ways, there's only one villain that managed to top him. And by now, I think we all know where this is going. And by process of elimination, number one has gotta be... the Evil Entity. Yeah, I know it might be a cop-out to place the final episode's villain in the number 1 spot, especially in this regard, but considering everything we got through it, and I do mean everything, it greatly deserved the spot. The whole show was building up to this thing, and it gave a really epic delivery. Here we have a destructive godlike being that was stored away for centuries through different dimensions, and here in the final episode, we at long last get to see it in all its might. The base design already gave off a fairly creepy feel, but that element's boosted up by the many things we get to see it do in its reign, like merging with Pericles, possessing the Krieg Staffelbots to its command, unleashing an unstoppable army to gather helpless sacrifices, which includes seeing the deaths of so many characters we got to know, and even taking over all of Crystal Cove. And given everything he had to throw at them, the gang had to resort to giving it all they got through their work as a team, based on the interactions and cooperation that they developed over this whole series. And when it was said the entity was responsible for everything that happened, it wasn't kidding, as its defeat completely erases the reality the gang used to know, and dropped them in a whole new timeline that affected everything around them. Everyone and everything they've ever come to know are essentially no more, and are now replaced with entirely new versions of these people, things, and locations that they now have to adapt to for the remainder of their lives. For real, this goes a lot deeper than I ever would have expected. This kind of thing could be compared to some of those high-range movie villains like Sarah Ravencroft or the cat monsters from Zombie Island. And this thing left one of the biggest and most impactful endings we could have gotten from this generation, and in general, the greatest villain we could have gotten from this show. Whew, we did it! All 49 villains covered and ranked. This was quite a journey, and definitely one of the biggest videos we've ever put together. I can't speak for everyone, but I certainly had a good time during this adventure, though I can already imagine it'll take a long time before we can begin production on another one of these Scooby-Doo rankings. But hey, maybe if we get enough channel memberships and or pledges through Patreon, maybe the next ranking will start up a bit sooner than I expected. Or at the very least, it'll definitely help the flow of other videos too. Any bit would help, and be greatly appreciated. So anyway, looking through all these villains, there was certainly a huge variety. And as expected, they had their ups and downs. And chances are you might have some difference of opinions you'd like to share. I'm not sure how much this needs to be said, but of course this whole video was mostly just my opinion. So there's a chance you may agree or disagree on the placement of some of these villains. And whatever you'd like to say, I would love to hear it in the comments. So as I was planning the layout for this whole ranking, I had a surprisingly easy time placing the last 3 villains, though I was still debating on where specifically to put them. I mean, Rude Boy and the Ska-Tastics were definitely the best when it came to entertainment, though I still thought Krampus and the Entity deserved a higher placing given their impact to the show. And maybe I could have missed something going into them, so feel free to tell me if that's the case. So taking another look back at this show, I've been reading through some reviews, and I guess I should have seen this coming. I've noticed a lot of people saying they found this to be the only show in the franchise that managed to outdo the original show. Now, do I feel that way? Well, that's kinda hard to say. Sure, this show had a really intriguing story and arcs that played out surprisingly well, something that we've never really seen in the franchise at this level before, or at least in show form. There were many episodes that had a nice balance between some of the elements, whether goofy or serious. There were new characters that interacted greatly with this location and the main characters from older Scooby-Doo shows and Hanna-Barbera products that interacted with the main characters, which served as a nice wink to the longtime fans, and the main characters themselves had some pretty interesting spins on their usual personas, be it for comedy reasons, emotional reasons, or maybe something else. I especially liked the direction they went with Fred and Daphne's chemistry.
For goodness sake, Fred Jones, your obsession with traps is turning into a problem. The moment you start setting up a trap, you can't stop talking about it. You keep letting it cloud your mind, even when I try to talk to you. You need serious help, Fred.
Oh, sorry, Daph. I didn't know you felt that way about this side of me. If you'd prefer, I could always go back to my What's New Scooby-Doo phase. You remember, back when I used to make random Elvis references of the blue suede shoes.
On second thought, stick with your trap obsession. Please.
Aw, I knew you still cared. But on the other hand, the original show had a bit more of that classic feel to it that everyone loved too. It crafted the main gang into the icons they're seen as today. It had some pretty good jokes I'm sure some people even find funny in these recent years. It had a strong nostalgic sense and gave us a lot of memorable villains too. So with all this in mind, I'll have to take a bit to think about which show I thought was better. But in the meantime, we're gonna take a bit of a rest to plan out the next video. What video will that be? Well, like I always say at the end of these videos, we'll soon see, won't we?